In an earlier video, I have called the radical environmental movement the green cult. It has all the characteristics of a religious sect. One universal characteristic of cults is false prophecy. More than any other quasi-religious movement, the Greens abound in false prophecies. In fact, they have produced more false prophecies than any religious sect in history. Let me cite just a few. This past week, Andrew Follett in National Review noted, quote, "A new article in a scientific journal claims that we have just 6 years left to save the planet from global warming." End quote. Follett then adds, this is a claim environmentalists masquerading as scientists have been regurgitating for at least the last 50 years. The first Earth Day was in 1970, and that seemed like an especially rich year for environmental hysteria and false prophecies. Paul Ehrlich declared in April 1970 that, quote, "increasing population makes mass starvation imminent. The death rate will increase until at least 1 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death during the next 10 years. Global warming will cause with near certainty the collapse of civilization in the next few decades." Ehrlich is a professor at Stanford. He later called for the poisoning of water supplies with fertility-blocking drugs. Not only was he was wrong in exactly the opposite direction. Instead of starvation, civilization has experienced the greatest explosion in food security of all time. David Brower was the first executive director of the Sierra Club. He said all potential parents should be required to use contraceptive chemicals, and the government should choose those parents it will allow to have children. In 1982, the executive director of the UN Environment Program, Mustafa Tolba, claimed that an environmental catastrophe which will witness devastation as complete, as reversible as any nuclear holocaust would occur in just 18 years, that is, by the year 2000. I was alive in 2000, but I don't recall anything resembling a nuclear holocaust. In 1989, a senior UN environmental official said entire nations would be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if extreme government action was not taken by the year 2000. So far, none of those nations is underwater. In fact, the nation in the world most below sea level is Holland, and it is one of the richest nations in the world. Environmentalists don't really believe their own prophecies. Barack Obama bought an island. In 2006, former Vice President Al Gore claimed that unless world leaders took drastic measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, Earth would surpass the point of no return in 10 years. A true planetary emergency, he called it. Of course, by 2016, nothing of the sort had happened. In 2018, teen activist Greta Thunberg promoted on social media the warning that climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years. Well, it's been 5 years. We're still here. Her tweet has since been quietly deleted. Then this spring, the New York Times said, "Breaking news! Earth is likely to cross a critical global warming threshold within the next decade unless drastic changes are made." I have in my files literally 100 more false prophecies like these. I link some of them below. What should we make of all this? Well, for one thing, these predictions are not harmless. The real catastrophe is not climate change. The real catastrophe is what governments force on people to combat it. You think my rhetoric is a bit overwrought? False environmental prophecies have cost more lives than any other predictions in the history of planet Earth. We are approaching the 200 million mark for forced abortions alone in order to control population, all in the name of the theology of the green cult. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concludes that Earth is doomed unless the international community agrees immediately to a multi-pronged strategy to combat climate change. The strategy recommends several things. 1, that developed nations self-deindustrialize. The strategy also calls for the transfer of billions upon billions of dollars from developed nations to the governments of developing states as part of a just transition to renewable energy. Again, Andrew Follett, quote, ridiculous environmentalist claims and concerns about overpopulation have not only spurred out-of-control government spending, they have directly led to horrific human rights abuses, such as the forced sterilization or abortion of roughly 700 million people during China's decades-long one-child policy and India's forced sterilizations. The extent of the human rights nightmare that can result from overpopulation and eco-hysteria is difficult to overstate. End quote. Human sacrifice occupied a particularly important place in Mesoamerica. Many of the region's cultures, including the Maya and the Aztecs, believed that human sacrifice nourished the gods. Without it, the sun would cease to rise and the world would end. Walter Prescott calculated that the Aztecs sacrificed 2 million people on their altars because of their theological commitment to making the sun rise. Modern environmentalists have killed far more because of bad theology. Back in the year 2000, Ronald Bailey of Reason magazine asked this question: what will Earth Day look like when Earth Day 60 rolls around in 2030? He predicted a much cleaner and much richer future world with less hunger and malnutrition, less poverty, and longer life expectancy, and with lower mineral and metal prices. And he makes another prediction about Earth Day 2030. Quote, there will be a disproportionately influential group of doomsters predicting that the future and the present never look so bleak. In other words, the hype, hysteria, and spectacularly wrong apocalyptic predictions will continue, promoted by the environmental grievance hustlers. End quote. In Deuteronomy 13, the Old Testament calls for the execution of false prophets. The least we can do in the modern world is ignore them. It will save a lot of lives. Thanks for listening. May our God, who spoke our earth into existence and continues to bless and nourish it, bless you this day in a mighty way.